I wasn't the first one who was slated to be here. It was actually my colleague and Rohingya founder of Rohingya Project, Muhammad Noor. I'm here. My name is Saqib Sheikh, and I am the project director for the Rohingya Project. I'm also very familiar with Simon because we were there at the Migrant Nation event. So I'm glad to see that some of the themes that we talk about with the Rohingya Project are being talked about on a much larger level. And what I hope to do today is not just introduce a project, but perhaps give a bit of explanation of why we felt this project was necessary, and then what may be a bit unique in our approach towards this issue of statelessness. And as I go along with describing the project itself, I'll state very openly, a lot of what we're describing is not new in the sense that we're coming up with some fancy new technology or some very different, radically different application. What makes it a bit different is perhaps the use case specific to the Rohingya and how we're going about doing it, which is different from maybe a standard NGO approach. Okay, going right into it. Okay, so we start by saying by the Rohingya, for the Rohingya. The reason we say this is because not just our founders Rohingya, but also most of our team is Rohingya. We have around 40 to 50 Rohingya staff members, and I'm one of the minorities who's not Rohingya. I'm Pakistani American, so I'm hoping in a few years they would call me honorary Rohingya. But our approach is very much grassroots driven. We feel that for the Rohingya, who are of course suffering, as we all are aware, anybody who reads the headlines, from persecution in Burma, any really substantive approach that is going to be a game changer has to come from the Rohingya diaspora community itself, and recognizing the tremendous work that is done by NGOs, done by UN agencies, and done by different governments in different capacities. We recognize that. But as I'll explain, there is a case of what you could call institutional paralysis on the Rohingya issue, which necessitates a solution coming from the community itself. Okay. So talking a bit just about the problem statement, this is just a very large overview. Our project is focused on financial inclusion of the Rohingya through a digital ID system brought to us by blockchain. And I'll explain why we're using blockchain and what the nature is of the financial system. But just to first start, what is the reality for a young Rohingya today? Now, our project, we try and separate Rohingya into two categories. One is, or you could say three categories. One are the Rohingya who are in Rakhine State right now, who are in a conflict zone. And I don't need to elaborate further on what they're going through. The second are Rohingya who are refugees, those who are escaping persecution with nothing more than perhaps the clothes on their back and maybe a few possessions. And their situation is one of needing immediate humanitarian aid and needing provisions such as food, shelter, a bag of rice, etc. Those are the Rohingya refugees. Of course, we know that in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar, you have a large part of them. And the third category are stateless Rohingyas. So not all Rohingya are refugees, but almost all Rohingya are stateless. And by stateless, we mean those Rohingya who are in diaspora, who have been situated in host societies like Malaysia, Thailand, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, for 2, 3, and now coming to maybe 4 generations. And in their specific situation, they may have been born in their host society. They've never seen the Rakhine State, they've never seen their homeland. But they are, in terms of their identification, deprived of the most basic tool of a 21st century citizen. So the vast majority of Rohingya don't have the basic tool of identification. Even in Malaysia, where we're situated, only a fraction of the Rohingya are able to actually even get a UNHCR card. So when I talk about institutional paralysis, depending on the Rohingya, which country they're in, and what the political nature is in that country, they either have access to certain resources or they don't. But almost as a common thread throughout the diaspora situation, we find that having access to an identity is one of the most common problems. And it's hard to get a consensus of how many of them are deprived of an ID, but it's somewhere along the ranges of 70, 80%. So you can consider the vast majority of the stateless diaspora are deprived of that. And UNHCR is doing their work in terms of trying to provide a ID card. Some countries are not even allowed to operate, so the Rohingya who are in those countries don't receive that. In a country like Malaysia, for example, there are restrictions for how many Rohingya are able to get access to the ID. So the Rohingya who are there, there's no likelihood for them to get citizenship. They're deprived of actually participating in the local economy. And then at the same time, even a UNHCR card is considered a luxury which only a few of them are able to access to. And this has been the reality not just recently, but perhaps you can say the last 20 to 30 years. And the reason why we say from the Rohingya, from the community is, imagine yourself, if you're a Rohingya, would you wait necessarily for a solution to come from existing institutions? Is there a likelihood in the foreseeable future of the Rohingya being repatriated back into their homeland? It's looking unlikely, I mean, to say the least. And given their state in their host societies, can they expect citizenship or work permit or something that can give them access to a livelihood? That also seems very unlikely. So it's because of this unique situation that the Rohingya are in, and I'm not pretending that the Rohingya situation is the same situation for all displaced people, because we know it's not. These basic issues are the ones that most Rohingya suffer from. Lack of education, social exclusion, access to technology, so lack of digital literacy, and then lack of access to capital and financial resources. These are situations of statelessness, not necessarily those of immediate humanitarian aid. So this is what we're trying to tackle with our project. Yeah, I'll just skip this. Okay. The way our project is approaching it is we are looking at the issue of financial exclusion as an enabler to other basic rights, such as healthcare, education, legal rights, because if you have access to at least some capital, you're able to open these doors, whereas if you don't have access to capital, all of these doors remain closed. So we see financial inclusion as, you can say, a seed that we want to plant to give those Rohingya who are in diaspora something that over the course of maybe a decade can develop into something resembling of a microeconomy or a microeconomic institution. Okay, so just a background of the project. What we're looking at is trying to unlock different opportunities using a blockchain-based digital ID, and I'll explain why we're using the digital ID system. But our project is not an ID project. We're not trying to come forth with a competitive ID solution to replace the UNHCR existing ID or to come up with some national ID card or anything like that. What we're trying to do is create a dedicated financial platform that is Rohingya specific, but also that can be used as a model for other marginalized community, and have as an access key to that a digital ID, because you need to be able to recognize the user who's actually using it before you can actually grant them access to financial services, hence the need for the ID. Okay, so 3 phases, and this is the case with a lot of these startup projects. I mean, we're in the first phase where we're developing the foundations. We have a list of partners who are helping us in developing the ID infrastructure, the financial infrastructure, and scaling is the stage that we're looking after that. How can we take some best use cases in Malaysia that we're piloting and then broaden them to other more sensitive countries where the Rohingya are also living in substantial numbers. And then finally, seeing if we can build a virtual community of a sort. I wouldn't use the term virtual state, and actually I'm very skeptical of tech utopian sort of language and approaches to this problem, even though some people may accuse us of that. But what I see is, can, within the existing system of the UN, of NGOs, and of governments, you can create a complementary system that can get the community to empower itself and to collaborate and build consensus within them using technology that we already have at our fingertips. Can that be done rather than this aid model that builds a dependency of that refugee community, of that stateless community, where you don't have an end in sight? So that's what we're trying to look at with the Rohingya project. We are starting in our initial stage as a financial service provider. Our hope is, as we move on, as we build into a broader system, that system can be taken on by the Rohingya themselves, and through different tools they can build consensus and look to not necessarily have a governing structure, but some way they can collaborate across borders with technology that we already know lends itself towards those functions. Yeah, okay. So, yes.
Do you have a time period for each of those phases?
Yes, so right now we're in phase 1, we're pushing our pilot next year, and then phase 2 is the year after that, where we broaden outside of Malaysia into use cases and then we don't necessarily have a timeline for phase 3. That's more of a long-term vision. Okay, I'll just skip over this. This is just a statement of where the Rohingya are at right now in terms of their financial situation. So phase 1, we want to have a digital ID, pilot ID that can be tested with 1,000 Rohingyas, build an ecosystem around that. We have 2 applications that we're working at right now, and before I end, I'll give you a demo of how the application works. But the idea is that Rohingya, give them a specific dedicated crypto token that they can build and use among themselves, not necessarily as a financial tool, but as a social capital. So for specific functions within the community, if within the community an area needs to be cleaned, some people need to be taught, those who have access to education can extend that to others. Why not use the crypto token to give the Rohingya a sense of a wider Rohingya community spirit? That's the idea with the token that we want to launch beginning in January. And then having that as a test case and building that beyond just Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where we're based. So this is a question we get asked often. I'll very quickly mention it. We can maybe talk about it more in the discussion. How do we verify if somebody is Rohingya? We use an existing model that UNHCR has developed where they look at specific criteria related to geography, social, who is their social contacts, testing them on Rohingya language, cultural traditions, and professions. And then based on that, UNHCR is able to determine that somebody is Rohingya. Our model is using the same thing, it's just going a bit more into detail. Why are we using blockchain? It's not because it's a fancy technology, it's because it lends itself to the Rohingya case specifically, given its nature as a decentralized ledger. And we're very much aware of, for example, data regulations related to GDPR and putting personal data on the blockchain. So with our ID partners, we're developing the ID that can just have a basic function of being an access key without necessarily putting anybody's personal data at risk. Okay, this is I just want to focus on, so how would it look like? Actually, I'll just play the video later. Okay, so what does the future look like with this project? This is not necessarily our utopian view. What we see is if we can create a system where a financial service provider working within the community is able to add existing functions and then get Rohingya to be involved in those functions, to get them to collaborate more among each other within a host country, and then from that host country to other host countries, provide different services, you have a you can say, a foundation to what could be considered a 21st century microeconomy. And that can be tailored specifically for a stateless people. So this is our broad grand vision that we're looking at with different features that are available specifically to Rohingya, but again, can be tailored to other cases. So I'll end by just playing the video, if you can, of our application, so that those who are in the crowd right now, you can at least see how the application is intended to work, and then hopefully that can be a conversation starter, because I know my presentation probably generated more questions than answers. And also, I don't pretend to have all the answers, because this is the first step for a very, very long journey that we're taking. We don't pretend that we have everything solved out. What we do realize is that the status quo is untenable, and something has to change, so we're deciding from within the community to take that first step. Do we have the answer to everything? No, but we hope that, you know, through forums such as these, we can get more of those answers. So if, on that note, we can just play the video of the application. Do you have the video? The video? Okay, before I sign off, that actually was developed by Naeem, who's our Rohingya animator, so I just wanted to give him a plug because I told him I would. Thank you.
Thanks very much.